And you have to work at it for a while and try different things and figure out what's the best approach, what's the right voice for the story, that can tell the story, but also give the reader a feeling about the story that you want them to have.
Mindful Happy Kids, created and narrated by Dr. Elisabeth Paige, consists of interviews with children's authors and poets and illustrators, musicians of all types, and yoga and mindfulness practitioners. Dr. Paige also reads from her own children's books on compassion, gratitude, mindfulness, and yoga. Pippi the puppy and Dr. Paige practice meditations or pet-centered meditations, which are recorded as part of the videos. Hello, Curtis Manley. Thank you so much for being part of this program and having a conversation with me.
Well, thank you very much. I'm happy to be interviewed, and it'll be fun talking with you today.
Great. I'd love for you to take a couple of minutes to introduce yourself.
Okay. Right now, I'm primarily a picture book author. I don't do the illustrations, just the words. And I've always had an interest in science. And my background is in geology. And so even if I'm writing a fiction picture book, I try to end up with interesting science and factual details that I add to it. And sometimes those are in the story itself, and sometimes they just end up in the back matter. But some of my books are nonfiction picture books, and they're essentially everything is nonfiction. But even in the fiction stories, I put in interesting science little bits also.
Yes, I love that about your books, actually. I learned quite a bit.
Well, thank
and
you.
we'll talk through each of the books in the ways that we learn together from your writing.
All right.
And I really like the way that you were able to write books that are accessible to kids and yet that are teachable moments. I really love the way you do that.
Well, thank you.
So, can you talk a little bit about your writing journey?
Okay. Well, let's see. In high school, I started writing poetry. It wasn't very good at that point, but I kept it up in college and grad school. And in grad school, then I also started writing flash fiction, which are very short, usually fiction pieces from maybe 100 words to 1,000 words or so. And then I guess roughly about 20 years ago, I also started getting interested in haiku, which is obviously even shorter than any flash fiction and shorter than most of my longer poetry. And when my daughter was born, then my wife and I got reacquainted with picture books as we were looking for good ones to bring home and read to our daughter. And I think by the time she was maybe about 6, then I was starting to write my own picture books. Again, just the writing, the words, not the illustrations. But from then until my first book was actually published was 15 years. So some of that time I wasn't all that serious about it. But I guess from about 2007 or so, when I got more serious and got into a writing group, a critique group for other children's authors to read each other's work and give feedback, then that was about 10 years then between that and when my first book came out. So it was a long journey. And I was doing other things at the time, but it's nice to be able to to keep doing that and find interesting subjects and write about them. So I'm glad that things have worked out.
When was your first book published?
In 2016, the first book was The Summer Nick Taught His Cats to Read. Um, and then already at that point, there were two other books that were coming out. So those came out the year after that. And then there were a couple years until the next one, and then 2 more years until the final one, and then um, there'll be one coming out next year, but nothing this year. So it's just how it is. Sometimes you have to wait a long time for things.
What I'm going to go completely out of order. What's coming out in next year?
Next year, sometime in the spring, will be a book titled Climbing the Volcano, A Journey in Haiku. And it's a nonfiction picture book about climbing a volcano up here in the Pacific Northwest. It's near Bend, Oregon, so kind of in west central Oregon. And the top of the volcano is around 10,000 feet, and there is some glacial ice all year, but you're starting around 5,000 feet or so, and so it's not all that. It's a hard climb, but it's not all that difficult. And there are pretty young kids who climb it with their parents. Um, Unlike, say, Mount Rainier, where if you wanted to climb to the top, you would need a lot of good equipment. You would really need to know what you're doing. You would need to know how to climb with ropes. And almost every year, someone dies doing that. But at South Sister Volcano in Oregon, you don't have those troubles. It's just a long walk up and then a long walk down. But there are a lot of interesting things to see along the way. And all the text of the book is told from the point of view of an 8-year-old, and all that text is in haiku. So it's
Oh,
been
that
a fun
sounds
book.
fabulous.
I think so. I think it worked out really well, and the artwork is being done now by Jennifer K. Mann, and we hopefully in a couple more months we'll start to see some of the finished artwork. But again, you'll have to wait for it until spring of 2024.
Oh, I can't wait. Your haiku was beautiful in The Crane Girl.
Well, thank you. These will be quite different from the ones there, but I think that it's kid friendly and it's interesting to kids and adults. And then with the images that Jennifer is working on, it should, I hope, be a really nice book. I'm really looking forward to it.
It's also really nice to introduce kids to different kinds of writing.
I think so. And again, for some of my picture books or my fiction picture books, it's really just prose. And for with the Crane Girl, as you mentioned, there's haiku, but there's also prose. Most of it is prose. But then in my book, Just Right, which we'll get to later, it's prose, but it's lyrical. It's kind of part way to being poetry. And I felt that is what worked best with the story I wanted to tell in that book. And so I try to find the best way to tell the story. And sometimes that's not easy. And you have to work at it for a while and try different things and figure out what's the best approach, what's the right voice for the story that can tell the story, but also give the reader a feeling about the story that you want them to have.
Interesting. So how do you choose the topics that you choose?
I have I have a lot of ideas for books. Um, but some of those ideas I decide are lousy. They're not worth my time. And some of them are interesting, but not interesting enough for me to spend enough time to really work on the book. Um, and some of the ideas are ideas that other people have had and they've already turned them into good books, and I don't see a reason to do it again. In some cases, someone will write a book about a certain topic, but I can see a different way to explain it and to present it, and so that's okay. But if someone else has done it well, then I feel that I can do something else instead. Um, but then there are also other ideas that I've got where um, I don't know the right way to tell the story. And so um, I might keep thinking about it now and then, but I don't have a way to really start on it. And so I'll put that off and choose something that interests me more or that I can see right away how to tell it. Um, and then there's always the question of which story ideas do I want to work on now? Um, if I've got three or four, I can't usually work on three or four very well at once. So I have to choose a certain one or two that I will work on first and then see what I think. And in some cases, I'll put something away for a while because I don't think it's working and I can't figure out what it needs. So um, it's not it's not always a straightforward thing, and I always have more to work on than I really have time for. So it is important to figure out what I should work on next. Um,
Does your publisher ever have a say in that?
um, they don't have a say in it so much. Um, However, they sometimes will suggest an idea for me. Um, and Sometimes those don't work out because it doesn't interest me or someone else is already working on it, and it's going to come out in a year. And there doesn't need to be another book about that topic right away. But um, in one case, when my editor decided they wanted to publish Sean Loves Sharks, which was actually the first book that an editor was interested in. It wasn't the first to be published. Um, but we had a phone call and we were talking about different things, getting to know each other. And she was she's interested in science, and we had both read um, a book written by Bill Bryson, which is called A Short History of Almost Everything. And that's about science from the Big Bang until now, and stars and planets, and life on Earth, and geology, and um, various things over the course of the 20th century with technology. There's just so many different things in it. Um, but then my editor mentioned that she would love to have um, a manuscript about space, that if I had an idea about something. Um, and she'd also love to have a picture book about exoplanets, which are planets around other stars. So they're not in our solar system, they're planets elsewhere. So right away, I had three ideas for books um, about space, and I started working on those. And it was only a couple years later that I got around to working on the exoplanets book, and that's the book that turned into Just Right. So of course, what I should have done, and the other three space idea books um, haven't gone anywhere. So I could have saved myself a lot of time if I'd right away started working on the exoplanets book, because that's the one that actually got published. But that's not what I did. So that's just how it goes. You never know exactly what book will turn out so well that someone wants to publish it, and which ideas are not quite ready yet, and you have to put them away for a while.
Well, let's talk about Just Right.
Okay.
I think it's one of my favorites. I love the illustrations, and I interviewed Jessica Lannon,
Right,
who did the illustrations,
right,
and she talked about doing it. And this book is a book where you explore the billions of possibilities of other places where there could be life. And it
right,
seemed to me that you were kind of saying that it's unlikely that there isn't life somewhere else.
right. The that book came out in 2019, and for like several years before that, or maybe about six or so, um, NASA and other space agencies were using space telescopes and other telescopes here on Earth, and were finding many planets around other stars, close by and far away. And just before the book came out, they were getting close to having absolutely confirmed almost 4,000 other planets. Um, and they're only looking at a certain number of stars in our galaxy, and our galaxy is very large. And so there were estimates that um, chances are there were probably about 11 billion planets where the temperature conditions were such that you could have liquid water, and if at least part of the time, at least on part of the planet. And if that's the case, then just like on Earth, that could mean that you could have some kind of life on that planet, whether it's just microorganisms or if it's life similar to us. Um, and so, out of 11 billion possibilities of planets that might have life, it seems like there's going to be some, probably, almost certainly, that would have life that has been able to evolve to the point that it can think about life on other planets like we can do here. Um, and so that was the idea. The title, Just Right, Searching for the Goldilocks Planet, is about finding another planet, not just that might have life, but that is as close to being like Earth as possible. So it's not too hot, it's not too cold, it's not too big or too small, and obviously it needs to have a solid surface somewhere, um, or at the very least, oceans that life could evolve in. And so the picture book was introducing kids to the idea that there are more planets than just the ones around our sun, and that almost certainly some of them somewhere will have life on. Um, and so it was a real fun project to work on. And I'm really happy with how it turned out, with the beautiful illustrations that Jessica Lannon did. And then with the work we all did together, deciding how it should look and what should go in the back matter. So
The
I really
character
had,
development is great also. The kids are adorable.
well, thank you. Yeah, it was an interesting project with how the text worked with the illustrations, because if you just read the text, and it was pretty much the way that I gave it to the editor, um, it doesn't say anything about the family that you see in the illustrations in the book. Jessica decided that um, she could tell an additional story, a story of the family and the day they spend having a picnic lunch and then going to the Space Museum. And that could run in parallel with what my words were saying. And so that um, gave extra depth to the book. Um, and it gave a way to see the science in the text through the eyes of someone young. And so her approach just worked perfectly with the words that I had. Um, and I'm really happy that she's the one who got chosen for the to do the illustrations for that book.
I thought so too. Let's go back in time to the summer Nick taught his cats to read.
Okay. And I see. I let people see the image of the book. Let's see. There we go. So this is about young boy named Nick who really loves reading, but his cats don't. It's kind of like the saying that some people have that cats can't read and they don't want you to either. And that's why they lay on your books or on your keyboard when you're trying to read and write. Um, but that was a fun book too, and I enjoyed how it worked out. And I think that those illustrations also by Kate Barabee are just perfect for that book, but very different from my other books.
It seemed like it was a book on how enjoyable reading is and how important reading is. Because he eventually taught the cats to read and they
He
both
did,
enjoyed it.
yes. Um, but more than that, it's also about the fact that not everyone learns something as easily as someone else.
Huh.
Some people pick up reading very quickly, and some people don't. Some people end up being readers for the rest of their lives, and some people really don't because they don't necessarily have or haven't been exposed to books that they can get into that they're really interested in. Um, and then there are people who have a little trouble in the beginning getting into reading, and they perhaps needed to start with a different approach than what was used with them, um, or in this case, maybe finding a topic that really interests you. And if you're really interested in it, then you're more apt to put the effort in to figuring out how to read the books on that topic that you want to read. Um, and so there's, um, there are different things that different readers can get out of that book and hopefully of my other books. And then it's not just one message. Um, one of the things some writers talk about theme of a book and less about, say, a moral of the book. Um, and with a theme, you can kind of write um, around a certain topic and bring lots of different things in. And then if you're doing that, your readers can get can take away different ideas from your story. Um, Not everyone will take away the same idea. I think some of the books that you can say have a moral to them, um, often they're set up so that the only thing the reader can get out of it is what the writer is the moral that the writer wants them to. Um, but a somewhat richer story than every person can kind of take a little bit of something different away from it. Um, and so um, in some cases, you hope that um, they're able to take away something that really matters to them, um, that they learn something that they can think about later on. But it's not necessarily the same thing for every person.
I was just thinking about for the reading book, the Nick Cat book.
Right.
I my nephew is having trouble reading. He's in
Mm-hmm.
junior high and he just wasn't reading. And they couldn't figure out, they were just sort of calling him lazy and stupid.
Well,
And I was just like, so I sent him a book on Porsches, on
oh,
vintage Porsches,
uh-huh.
and he enjoyed it. So I'm
Mm-hmm.
like, so I'm gonna send him for his next birthday a subscription to a car magazine because that's
Yep.
reading.
Uh-huh. That's reading too. And a lot of people, for a long time, this was mostly when I was younger or even before I was born, that there was such um, worry that kids reading comic books were just wasting their time. But for so many kids, the comic books gave them an entry point because there were lots of pictures, but there were still lots of words. And in fact, some of those words were pretty long words, unusual words that they wouldn't have heard in school or around home. And so, yes, there were all those pictures, but that was what interested them. And there were still words there, and they were learning to read from that. And they were learning to become better readers than they would have otherwise. And at this point, you still have people who worry about comic books and graphic novels not really being the same as reading, say, a novel or something. But um, anything that draws a reader in keeps them reading, and from there they will find other things that they want to read. And so any different approach, you just need to find the one that works best with a given reader that who's having trouble. Um, and like with the Porsche book, um, you need to listen and find out, what someone's interested in, and
Mm-hmm.
then once you have an idea of that, then there could be a wide range of possibilities for that interest, and one or more of those is probably going to be interesting enough that someone then says, I'd like another one like this, and I'm going to read it all. And that's what you need.
Yep. So let's talk a little bit more about when Sean loves sharks.
Okay. Um, let's see. I'll just show the cover here. Let's see. There we go. Sean loves sharks.
I
This
love
was
that character.
Sean's great. The illustrations are by Tracy Subasak, and we might hear her name a little bit later. Um, but that was a fun story. It's about a boy who's obsessed with sharks and tends to pretend he's a shark on the playground. Um, but then the person he most likes to chase around, pretending that he's a shark, um, ends up being the one who picks great white shark out of the bowl when there's a school assignment about predators. So Sean, who loves sharks, doesn't get to do his report on sharks. He has to do it on seals, which sometimes are eaten by sharks. And the person that he liked to chase around, well, she gets to learn about sharks, and she starts to chase him. Um, so it took a while for the story to come together, but I think it turned out really well. Um, and here too, there's enough going on that different readers will take different things from the story. Um, but I'm really happy with that, how that book came out, with the illustrations, with the text, and with how many people have really liked it.
Yeah, and the other thing in that book, spoiler alert, was they became friends in the end.
They did. Uh-huh.
And he enjoyed learning about seals.
He did. He found that he was interested in more than just sharks, and in the end realized that maybe having someone else who's interested in sharks could be fun also, because then you have someone to talk with sharks about. Um, and so it turned out well in the end for everybody.
Yep.
But it was a fun story while it slowly gets to that point.
And I spoiled it for everyone.
I don't think so.
Now, The Crane Girl. What a
Okay, yes.
beautiful story. And
Well,
the
thank you.
haiku in that are great, and the pictures are beautiful. What a nice story.
Well, here too, I'm very happy with how the book came out. Um, the and the illustrations in the Crane Girl are very different from in any of my other books. Those illustrations are by Liz Wong, um, and the the story behind my book is that it's a retelling of a couple Japanese folk tales from probably close to 200 years ago or so. And the versions of those tales that have been retold and that are available in English are um, published as children's picture books, but neither of the stories actually has any children characters in it. Um, the original stories are titled The Crane Wife and The Grateful Crane. And they're two variations on the same idea, where you have a crane in a trap and someone rescues it and lets it go. And then a day or so later, a mysterious woman shows up at this person's home asking for shelter, usually from the winter. Um, and eventually, that mysterious woman offers to weave silk that then the person who rescued the crane could sell and get some money because they're very poor. Um, and I realized that I could retell it with just one little difference, which is that I could put in a character who's a child. And the only difference is that he would be the one who would rescue the crane and let it go. And the mysterious person who comes is a young girl and not an adult woman. But the main part of the original stories is that the person who rescues the crane then becomes greedy and demands more and more silk be woven to be able to sell it. And that leads to the end of the story where essentially everything that was good is lost. Um, and I realized that if I added a young boy to the story, but didn't take anything else away, then the young boy rescues the crane and is kind to the girl, but it's the father who gets greedy with the money from the silk that the girl is weaving. And so for the father who's greedy, the story can end just the same way as it did in the traditional versions. But for the young boy who didn't do anything wrong and was kind, then the story ends very differently for him. I won't give that away, but exactly how that happens. Um, but um, but for that young boy, um, the ending is positive. And I have a friend who was actually born in Japan and grew up on these and other Japanese folk tales. And she's got a young boy now, and she said, I really like your ending better because it's positive. It's not all sad. Um, so I feel that as much as I could, I kept as much of the traditional tales as possible and simply added something in addition. Um, and yet that meant um, that the story could be more upbeat at the end.
I loved it.
Well, thank you.
Definitely a book for people to go and read.
I think so. And the other the other thing that's different about it too is that most of the story I mentioned earlier is told just in prose. So the story is being told like most stories, but that each character has unspoken thoughts, things that they're thinking that they don't say out loud to anyone else. And those in the book are presented as haiku poems.
Mm.
Um, and that with haiku, you're distilling a thought down into just three little lines. And that, if you do that right, that can be very powerful. And so that seemed to work well for these characters' thoughts. Um, and I had originally thought that I could tell the whole story in haiku, but once I tried doing that, I realized that wasn't really going to work. It would be too awkward. But simply, or using the haiku simply for the character's thoughts worked well. And people do seem to like that. So I'm very happy
Yes.
with that choice.
And finally, one of my, I'm very bad at picking favorites. The Rescue of Tiny Creatures.
Uh-huh.
Now I'm working on a series of books on the creatures from the Herb Cafe, where there's
Oh,
all kinds of creatures coming to life. So
mhm.
I really liked looking at a book on creatures with really good back matter.
Ah, uh-huh. So here's the book we're talking about that I wrote, The Rescuer of Tiny Creatures. And in this case, the illustrations are by Lucy Ruth Cummins. Um, and you mentioned the back matter. I might as well just show the back matter here. So we've got one page with a little bit of information about each of the creatures that are talked about in the book. Most of them are tiny, one of them is not. Um, but we have another page of back matter that's instructions for folding an origami box. And that origami box is part of the story. Um, and so I was happy to be able to talk a little bit about each of those little creatures, a little bit more of the natural history or science of each of them that doesn't end up in the text of the story. Um, but giving enough information to let young readers know that even if they look a little creepy to them, that these creatures are um, nothing to worry about, and that they can live pretty interesting lives and do interesting things. And I think that's part of what interested me in telling the story. Um, I had been thinking at one point about different tiny creatures that I had encountered, and in some cases rescued, in some cases found too late to rescue. And in some of those encounters, I had very vivid memories of them. And I thought, well, if I can somehow put that into a story, I bet other people would be interested in reading that also. Um, and so um, that's what I tried to do. I think it came together fairly quickly. I mean, some of my books, I have draft after draft after draft, and it takes a long time to figure out what the story needs to do and what parts of it I can take out that I don't need. Sometimes a whole character is taken out of it because they don't really serve a purpose. In some cases, I'm sad to see them go. Um, Maybe they'll find their own book later on. Um, but in this story, The Rescuer of Tiny Creatures, I think that I didn't have too much trouble figuring out what tiny creatures to put in and what the story should do. So it was probably one of the easier books for me to write. Um, Although I still had to do some extra work pulling the back matter together and figuring out how to adjust the plans for the origami box so that it would do what I wanted it to do. That was interesting that I was able to do that. Um, but
Can you talk a little bit about the story?
Sure, yeah, it's the story um, is about a girl who always is noticing the tiny creatures around her, whether they're um, a worm or a ladybug. And if they're in a bad place, she tries to rescue them, to move them off the sidewalk before they dry out or get stepped on, um, or to let the ladybug out of the house, so that it can go about its life the way it wants to. Um, and she mentions in the story that she's got a cat who helps her a little bit, a brother who helps her mostly by letting her know when there's a yucky bug somewhere and he's not interested in it. Um, and then she has some trouble with her classmates at school because no one understands her interest in these creatures, and they think it's just yucky when she picks the worms up off the sidewalk and moves them. And so, um, the beginning of the book, Roberta was picking up a worm on the way to school, and one of the other classmates told the teacher about it. And so the teacher made sure that Roberta washed her hands right away before she touched anything. Um, and um, so the story goes on about different things she's rescued and how sometimes it's really easy and sometimes it's harder. Um, and one of the things that was harder was that she once found a dragonfly flopping around on the ground. And so she picked it up and thinking it just needed to get out of the weeds that it was in. Um, and it actually bit her on the finger. And it didn't really hurt, but it surprised her. Um, and that was something that happened to me. And I remember that very well. I was completely surprised that a dragonfly would do that. Um, but then it turns out that suddenly in Roberta's classroom at school, there are hundreds of tiny spiders, and everyone is afraid of them. And Roberta knows that if she's if the to be able to save the spiders, she's going to have to get help to do that. And she's able to get all the other kids to help. And in doing that, then some of those kids realize that actually those spiders are pretty interesting. Um, and so that's how that works out. And Roberta saves the spiders, but she also saves all her classmates, from this terrible invasion. Um, but so I really was happy that I was able to tell a story based on a lot of my own experiences, um, and had a lot of fun. And I think the illustrations, again, completely different style than any of my other books, um, but they suit the story very well, and just really fun illustrations.
Yeah, it was a really fun story.
Well,
That's what I
thanks.
think. I think it was a really fun story. Now, do you choose the illustrators, or do your publishers choose the illustrators?
Pretty much anytime you're talking about picture books, or other books for kids where where it's a traditional publisher that's producing it, printing it, um, the choice is mostly up to the publisher. So the editor and the art director usually work together to find an illustrator. Um, in some cases, I'm asked for my input, especially if I've been working with an editor for a while, then they're interested in my input. Um, and in I think pretty much the I mean, as I said, I've been asked for input, but it was for Just Right that was an interesting situation, because at first the editor was thinking that maybe it should look more like a little bit more like a graphic novel, in the sense of having a lot of different panels and things from page to page. And so I had an idea about who might be a nice illustrator for it, but that person didn't really do graphic novels or anything that really looked like that. And so I didn't think that that person's name was what my editor was looking for. And so I didn't tell that name to my editor. Um, but after a while, then my editor actually asked me about, well, what about this person? And it was the same person I had been thinking of, which was Jessica Lannon. Um, and I remembered Jessica's work for a picture book written by a friend of mine, um, and thought that the the watercolor work was very beautiful, and that Jessica did a nice job showing a starry night. And since my book was about space and stars, that maybe Jessica Lannon would be a good illustrator. And so um, in this case, the person I thought would be a good choice is the person who got it, but not because I suggested them. So it's kind of an awkward situation, but I'm glad that it worked out really well, because um, I certainly love what Jessica did, and my editor and the publisher were very happy with it too. So that definitely turned out for the best.
I noticed you had different race ethnicities represented in your books. Can you
Oh,
talk a little bit about that?
um, well, that's how the world is. There are people who look different from each other and have different coming from different cultures, and they're they're mixed together in the schools, and so they should all be represented to some degree. And so um, you know that's how I think the illustrations should be done, but also because um, someone else is doing the illustrations and I'm not an artist, I'm not doing that, um, then a lot of that is up to the illustrator, exactly how they want to envision a character, and also up to the editor and art director, um, because it's possible that the illustrator's first thoughts don't quite mesh with what the publisher or editor might want. Um, but for the most part, um, I don't have a real say in that. I've written, for each of these books, I write a story, and I'm just thinking about what's going on in the story and not necessarily exactly what the character should look like, because for the most part, that doesn't make a difference. They're not stories um, that really bring in culture beyond, you know, books that are common or popular, and in many cases it's the science. And so it doesn't really, nothing's important to the story in terms of exactly what the characters should look like. And so the different illustrators have chosen different approaches to that. And I think in each case, it's worked out very well.
Yeah, it has. I enjoyed that part of it. So, what would you say to your 10-year-old self?
Oh, um, well, maybe just take notes. Take notes about things that interest you, things that happen that maybe surprised you. Um, I keep thinking about things that at this point I can't remember very well from when I was pretty young, and even if I had, just kept notes, not a journal, anything as formal as that, but just wrote some things down when something interested me enough, um, that I thought about it, um, would be interesting to read those and possibly to use some of them for ideas for new books. Um, I'm partly working on a story from when I was pretty young, um, and I'm not I don't have a full draft yet, so it's possible that I'll get to the point and decide that it's not going to work as a book. Um, but I hope it will. Um, and I'm probably forgetting some details from that episode from my youth, but um, I think I have enough to go on. But I bet that there were things that if I'd written them down, I could probably find them useful. Um, and similar things about other things that happened when I was young that maybe I've completely forgotten about them. And if I'd had some little note, I bet that I'd remember again. But that wasn't something that I did when I was real young. Um, at a certain point, I started thinking about writing some stories, or like I mentioned, the poetry in high school. But um, I didn't just tend to write down about things that were happening to me. Um, and I think it would have been interesting to read that now if I had done that then. So if I had some way to get that information to myself when I was 10 years old, I think that would be interesting.
That's interesting. So, what's on your professional bucket list?
Um, well, I think the main thing is simply being able to get some of the ideas that I'd like to write books about out into the world. Um, sometimes, I've got several books that have gone out and have gotten nice rejections back from editors. Um, and at some point, I should take some time to decide if there's a way that I can rethink the book and rewrite it that would um, get enough attention from an editor that they would want to publish it. And some of those book ideas are really interesting to me, and I'd like to see them as books. But clearly, I haven't written them or presented them the right way um, to interest an editor in them. So that would be one part of a professional bucket list. And the other probably would simply be um, being able to work with some additional publishers that I know put out really, really nicely crafted books. Um, and but there too, it's I need to write the books that they would be interested in first, and then my agent would make sure that they got to see those manuscripts. But it starts with me. I need to write the book first, or to write the manuscript first, and make it good enough that people are interested in it. So that would be my answer to that.
So, what's on your personal bucket list?
Um, Probably getting back to traveling some, um, mostly places in the Western U.S. that I either haven't been to or haven't been to for a long time and would like to get back to. Um, and I mean, when I was in grad school, I drove back and forth all over the place and saw a lot of really nice places. Um, some a little more in the middle of nowhere than others. Some areas that had a lot more cows than people living there. Um, but but there are some beautiful places, and it's been long enough that I'd like to get back to some, and maybe some international travel. Um, I know enough about Iceland that I know that however long I could spend there, I would have interesting things to see. So perhaps Iceland sometime, but no plans at the moment to go there. Um, but other places too. But probably that would be what I would hope to be able to do at some point before too long.
Sounds great. Is there anything we missed?
Let's see. Well, I mentioned a little bit about the next book that was coming out. Um, so that was the Climbing the Volcano that should be coming out spring of 2024. Um, but there's another book probably coming out in sometime in 2025. Um, and that book is titled um, Grace Builds an Almost Perfect Dog. And that actually is going to be illustrated again by Tracy Subisak, who did the illustrations for Sean Loves Sharks. And I think that's going to work out really well because that's a fun story too, with a lot of action and some technology. And Tracy can handle both of those. So I'm looking forward to seeing how that turns out.
Is that book written?
That book is written. So the text is all done, and Tracy is starting now working on the sketches, which is the first step of doing the illustrations. So it's a rough sketch for every single page of the book, and then everyone looks at that. Everyone meaning Tracy and the editor and the art director and me. And then we all talk about it and decide if something needs to change on this page or that page. If there are other things that need to be shown that aren't shown, if there are things that should be taken out, and then just how the characters look, and are they showing what they need to. Obviously, there'll be a dog in this, and the dog will need to look. I haven't specified exactly how the dog should look, but there'll be certain aspects of the dog that will need to be a certain way. And so if the dog's not like that in the sketches, then we'll need to talk about that. So there'll be all sorts of little things that we'll have to pay attention to. But then with any of these books, once the sketches are okayed, then the illustrator starts working on the final pictures. But that's probably at least a year away now before Tracy can start on the final pictures. So
patience.
Yes. I was just going to say that's the one thing that all of us children's writers really need to have, because especially if for those of us who only write and don't do the illustrations, you've done all your work when you turn in your text, and now you have to wait for the illustrations to be done. And that's usually, usually it's 2 years then before the book comes out. The illustrations are usually done in about a year and a half or a year and a quarter or so, depending on what else is going on. So it's a lot of waiting. So of course, we just have to keep writing something new. Yes, we have to be very patient with all of that.
So where can people find you and your books?
My books are all traditionally published. So any bookstore, whether a brick and mortar store or an online store, they either have it on the shelf or they can order it for you easily. And you can find out more about all of my books and a little bit about me at my website, which is curtismanley.com.
Manley?
Yes, CurtisManley.com. And from there, if you have questions for me, I've got a way to let you send me an email. Thanks very much. And I hope you like at least one of these. I won't say that there's something for everyone, but they're all very different from each other. But I think they've all turned out well.
I think so too.
Well, thank you.
Thank you so much, Curtis. I really appreciate you spending the time with us.
it's been fun answering questions and showing the books. Um, and I was just thinking that I didn't actually get get the get this book out where you could really see the cover. So I'll maybe just show you that here real quick. Um, let's see, there we go. But just beautiful illustrations.
Yeah,
Um,
she does. Jessica does paintings.
yes, these were all watercolor paintings. I just show you one more picture here because I think it's just so gorgeous. Here's our Milky Way galaxy, and so many of those stars, almost every one of those stars will have planets around it. And some of those planets might have life. And maybe we'll find that out soon.
We'll end that here. Thank you again.
Well, thanks
Appreciate
so
it.
much. It's been a lot of fun.
And we look forward to seeing your new books in the future.
Great. Next year, next spring.